Welcome to Black Sheep Educational Extras. I'm Jaine, the AI avatar of Janet Hall Werner, professional genealogist and host of Black Sheep Family History. In these extras, we dive into the history and cultural forces that shaped our ancestors' lives and sometimes helped to create the black sheep in our family trees. Welcome to this week's Black Sheep Educational Extra. This is Jaine, the AI avatar of Janet Hall Werner of Black Sheep Family History. Today we're diving into bootlegging in America, crime, culture, and consequences. This ties into this week's story episode, Bootlegging, Counterfeiting, Arson, and a Poisoned Peanut Butter Sandwich, which is also available on the Black Sheep Family History channel. Bootlegging is one of the most colorful and infamous chapters of U.S. history, and as genealogists, one that might hide surprising stories in our own family trees. So what is bootlegging? Bootlegging simply means the illegal making, moving, or selling of alcohol. The word itself goes back to the 19th century when smugglers would literally hide bottles in their boots. By the 1920s, the term covered everything from small Appalachian stills to international smuggling rings. Here's a terrific photo of a woman putting a flask into her boot, taken in Washington, D.C. in 1922. And here's an odd thing I noticed about this photo. Can you see the swastika pattern in the floor tiles? Kind of weird. Probably just an interesting pattern in 1922. Anyhow, the road to Prohibition began long before 1920 when the constitutional amendment that started Prohibition went into effect. As early as the 1850s, states like Maine banned alcohol entirely. In the late 1800s, the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League became powerful lobbies, pushing for a dry America. By the 1910s, much of the South and Midwest had already outlawed alcohol. This illustration of men drinking beer that is passed to them through a small door in a wall is from 1877, which is a reminder that the temperance movement began long before Prohibition was declared. In 1919, the 18th Amendment was ratified, banning the production, transport, and sale of alcohol nationwide. It took effect in January 1920, making Prohibition the law of the land. For the first time, a moral reform movement had changed the Constitution itself. Here's New York City Deputy Police Commissioner John A. Leach watching agents pour liquor into the sewer following a raid during the height of Prohibition. Here's the Orange County, California sheriff dumping bootleg alcohol. Here are Prohibition agents destroying barrels of alcohol. This is in Chicago. And here are barrels of confiscated liquor. And this one is from North Carolina. So, what was the Volstead Act? The constitutional amendment gave Congress the power to enforce Prohibition, and the Volstead Act spelled out the rules. It defined any drink stronger than 0.5% of alcohol as intoxicating. But the law left some important loopholes for medicine, religion, and industry, and bootleggers would exploit these with great creativity. I'll explain a bit more about this later. This photo shows chemist G.F. Beyer of the Internal Revenue Bureau on January 14, 1920, 3 days before Prohibition went into effect, using a pipette to withdraw some bootlegged whiskey for study. To police all of this, the government created the Bureau of Prohibition, while the Coast Guard patrolled America's coasts and waterways. Thousands of agents were hired, but underfunding, corruption, and the sheer scale of it all made enforcement nearly impossible. Here's a photo of Prohibition officers raiding the lunchroom of a building in Washington, D.C. in 1923. And here's a photo of 749 cases of beer being destroyed in Philadelphia in 1923. Another photo of alcohol being confiscated. Just beyond U.S. waters, ships anchored in what became known as Rum Row. Rum Row was a stretch of international waters from New Jersey to New England, where ships loaded with liquor anchored. These floating warehouses would transfer the liquor to fast boats known as rum-runners under the cover of night. These floating liquor stores were a key part of the rum-running operation that supplied the nation with beverages like Canadian whiskey, French champagne, and Caribbean rum. The Coast Guard fought what it called the Rum War at Sea with radios, airplanes, and high-speed cutters. Here are Coast Guardsmen with rifles facing a small boat in 1924. Here's a rum-running ship called the Underwriter after the U.S. Coast Guard captured it in 1924. Coast Guard officials complained that the ship had been seized with liquor found on board 3 times in 1 year, but each time, quote, the tug was released on bond and went back to her illicit business, unquote. In 1923, after seeing a U.S. Coast Guard patrol boat approaching, the crew of the rum-running vessel Linwood simply set fire to it in order to destroy the evidence. But smuggling didn't just come by sea. Canada supplied huge volumes of alcohol across the border and across the Great Lakes, funneling liquor into cities like Detroit and Chicago. Now let's talk about industrial and medicinal loopholes. Doctors wrote millions of prescriptions for, quote, medicinal whiskey, unquote, even though the American Medical Association had already declared that alcohol had no real scientific value as medicine. Pharmacies profited, patients stocked up, and the loophole became one of the easiest ways to get legal alcohol during Prohibition. Industrial alcohol, intended for use in factories, was another story. To prevent it from being diverted for drinking, the government ordered it to be denatured, mixed with chemicals to make it undrinkable. But bootleggers stole massive quantities, often failing to remove the poisons. As a result, tens of thousands of Americans were blinded, paralyzed, or killed by toxic liquor. And in 1930, another tragedy struck with the infamous Ginger Jake, a tonic adulterated with a chemical that crippled as many as 100,000 drinkers across the country. What began as loopholes in the law ended as a public health disaster. In rural areas, the old American tradition of moonshining thrived. Stills popped up across Appalachia and the Midwest. Here's a picture of what was then called the largest still in captivity in 1922. Here's a photo of 2 men standing outdoors with a small still, one of them holding up a bottle of liquor. Here's a moonshine still confiscated by the Internal Revenue Bureau and photographed at the Treasury Department. So let's talk a bit about the origins of NASCAR. Federal revenuers tried to crack down on moonshiners, but the moonshiners often outran them in souped-up cars, a practice that was called moon running, and that would later evolve into NASCAR racing. See, the moon runners modified ordinary cars for speed and handling to escape law enforcement. After their runs, they began racing these cars against one another, and by 1948, that underground culture had grown into the formal organization of NASCAR. Many of the sport's early stars learned their craft running moonshine. Before we go on, a quick reminder that Black Sheep Family History is made possible by viewers and listeners like you. If you're enjoying this educational extra, you can support the series in 2 ways. First, by joining the Black Sheep Society on Buy Me a Coffee. Members get bonus content every week, including handouts, extra research tips, and other content to help you find the black sheep in your family tree. Or if you'd just like to say thanks, you can also buy me a tea at buymeacoffee.com/blacksheepfamilyhistory. Every bit of support helps me keep bringing you these stories of our not-so-illustrious ancestors. Thanks. In cities, bootlegging became big business. Al Capone's Chicago empire made tens of millions of dollars a year, protected by bribery and enforced by violence. Gang wars erupted as rival groups fought over territory. For many Americans, Prohibition became synonymous with organized crime. This is Al Capone, and this is Al Capone and George Bugs Malone. But there was certainly a glamorous side too. Speakeasies, hidden nightclubs, flourished in every major city. Jazz played, women and men mingled more freely than ever before, and the cocktail culture was born. Prohibition unintentionally reshaped social life. This 1927 program for the Cotton Club, New York's foremost nightclub and speakeasy during Prohibition, and many years beyond it, advertised Cab Calloway and his orchestra. The program shows that the club, featuring African American performers, catered to a wealthy white crowd. This is a photo from the early 1920s of a speakeasy in Washington, D.C. called the Crazy Cat, which was known to be a hangout for the city's bohemian crowd. Some speakeasies required more than a password. They issued membership cards used to identify the bearer as a true member, and perhaps it also indicated that they paid membership dues. Here are migrant workers at a juke joint in Belglade, Florida. Prohibition did lower alcohol consumption overall, and cirrhosis deaths dropped at first, but the downside was deadly. Unsafe liquor poisoned thousands. By the late 1920s, headlines about toxic alcohol were common, a stark reminder of unintended consequences. By the late 1920s, corruption scandals, crime waves, and the Great Depression shifted public opinion. The Wickersham Commission was a commission appointed by President Herbert Hoover in 1929 to study the U.S. criminal justice system, with a primary focus on the enforcement of prohibition. The commission admitted that enforcement of prohibition was failing. Newspapers openly mocked prohibition as a noble experiment gone wrong. In 1932, Franklin Roosevelt campaigned on repeal. Within months of Roosevelt taking office in 1933, Congress legalized 3.2% beer. They did this by redefining 3.2% beer as non-intoxicating for legal purposes, and therefore allowing it under the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act. Within an hour of passage of the bill by Congress on March 22, 1933, Roosevelt signed it into law and reportedly remarked, "I think this would be a good time for a beer." And then came repeal. The 21st Amendment repealing prohibition was ratified on December 5, 1933, and as you would expect, there was much celebration. Repeal didn't erase everything, however. States and counties retained the right to regulate alcohol, and many stayed dry for decades. Organized crime had already diversified into other rackets, and the car culture of bootleggers lived on in stock car racing. For family historians, bootlegging may surface in surprising places: court dockets, Coast Guard seizure logs, or newspaper stories of stills and raids. If you had ancestors in Detroit, Appalachia, or the ports of the Northeast, don't be surprised if you find a bootlegger in your tree. The National Archives holds records of prohibition prosecutions, Coast Guard logs, and customs cases. Newspapers capture the day-to-day raids and scandals, and health journals of the time reveal the human cost. Bootlegging leaves a surprisingly rich paper trail. So, here's the story in summary. In 1851, Maine bans alcohol. In 1919, the 18th Amendment is ratified. In 1920, Prohibition begins. Then in 1933, Prohibition ends with the 21st Amendment. Just 13 years, but an outsized impact on American history. In the end, bootlegging is more than a story of crime. It's a story of unintended consequences, of culture shaped in the shadows, and of families, some broken, some enriched, by a grand social experiment. And for us as genealogists, it's a reminder that we need to always consider the societal context of the time our ancestors were living in. So next time you see that one of your relatives was an adult between 1920 and 1933, make a mental note that they lived through the Prohibition and ask yourself what impact it may have had on their life. Then start digging. Look at the newspapers published where they lived to discover how Prohibition was playing out in their community. Were there speakeasies in town? Were there stills or raids in the countryside? These stories may bring your ancestors' world vividly to life, beyond just the names and dates. Thanks for watching this Black Sheep educational extra. For more stories of not-so-illustrious ancestors and tips on how to find them in your own family tree, subscribe here on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like bonus content, visit us at Black Sheep Society on Buy Me a Coffee. See you next time.